Down in Petersburg, everything's fine. All them cats is drinking that wine. Drinking that mess is their delight. When you get drunk, start singing all night. Drinking wine's for you to drink wine. Wine's for you to drink wine. Wine's for you to drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Drinking that mess is their delight. When it gets drunk, start fighting all night.
Welcome to Tasting Anarchy. This is Jake Lindsay, and as always, I'm joined by Mason.
Mason Joseph.
And this week we have a very special guest who's actually our highest downloaded episode guest, twice. Mm-hmm. So our number 1 episode and our number 2 episode are the first Jackson Blood episode. By the way, everybody, Jackson Blood is our guest. Yeah. And our New Year's episode is the second most downloaded. So, Jackson, you are the most popular guest so far.
Good to know.
Yeah. And so I think
because he's out there pimping the episodes.
that could be too. And also because his knowledge of wine, I think, makes this show credible to some degree. So, I think that we've got a pretty cool show planned this week. I'll give into a little bit of the background of how I came up with this topic. I don't know what it was that I was doing, but I was looking through reading about Portuguese wines just because it's interesting to me, and also because Jackson was talking about how much he likes them a lot, and he did recommend actually the one that I'm going to review this week is a Jackson Blood recommendation. And I was just going online, reading around, waiting for somebody to respond to one of my tickets at work or something, and came across this EU like an investment report. So it's like a report. I guess it's like the bureaucrats of Europe doing like a review of how their money is being spent. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I came across some other stuff that was talking about how controversial the investment of EU money into different rural parts of Europe have been, like in particular rural Portugal. And the other thing that they were talking about was rural Sicily, which I thought was really interesting. So I was like, man, this is something I'd really like to talk about. Who can I have on to talk about it? And first person to come to mind was Jackson. So,
makes sense.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and I guess get into wine reviews real quick before we go into the main topic. Jackson, you said you have something that you're...
Yeah, so I've been trying to drink a bit more Washington wines lately, just sort of because I primarily drink European wines, try something local, try something domestic, Mm-hmm. So I'm drinking the Licole, and I've had a few of their wines before. And this is from the Seven Hills Vineyard in Walla Walla, Washington. And it's basically like a white Bordeaux blend, so it's 54% Semillon and 44% Sauvignon Blanc, and it's a pretty interesting wine. Not exactly what you would expect from white Bordeaux, but certainly I like it a lot more than the stuff I've had out of California trying to mimic the same style.
Okay, that is interesting. You said that's from Walla Walla?
Yeah, Walla Walla, Seven Hills Vineyard, Licole.
Okay. And Walla Walla is Columbia Valley?
So Walla Walla is right on the border with Oregon.
Oh, okay.
It's its own valley kind of region, and it's pretty far east, actually. You're looking at, you're sort of on the edge of a mountain range there, but I think you're 400 miles east of Seattle.
Okay. That's
as well, so.
Actually,
it's a warm region.
Okay. Earlier today I was actually out eating Mediterranean food with Victoria, my wife, and there's like a little wine shop next door to it. So I was like, well, I'm going to go in and get a wine by glass and then just bring it out here to eat with the food. And and I don't know why this I do know why it reminded me, because it was a Washington Cabernet Franc, and I've never had a Washington Cabernet Franc. And this was from the Yakima Valley. And I don't know where that is exactly. I've heard of it, and I meant to look it up, but just you sharing that wine reminded me of it. It was very different Cab Franc. It was much more like the California Cab Francs than like the Cab Francs from Loire. So it was just a very different type of wine.
Yeah. So with Yakima in that region, you're dealing with sort of a warmer climate, and it's not exactly why you would think, because you spend a lot of time up in Washington at your family's camp, etc. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When you go east of the Cascades, the landscape, everything gets completely different.
Okay.
So basically what the Cascades do is the Cascades are, generally speaking, they go from 14,000, 10,000 feet in elevation, and they sort of form a barrier between the Pacific coastal zones and sort of the interior of the United States. So the climate completely changes after you go past the Cascades because those mountains provide sort of a cloud cover.
Right.
And that's why the Pacific Northwest is such a rainy part of the country and more mild.
Yeah.
Whereas you go east, you're having much less sort of oceanic influences. You're having much more sort of arid conditions, greater diurnal changes in temperature. And so you're dealing with, 90, 100-degree days during a heat wave in the summer in Yakima. So the growing conditions are actually a lot more like during the growing season itself, besides the fall. You're dealing with conditions more similar to Napa than you would be to, say, the Puget Sound.
Wow. Okay. That makes
Just
a lot of sense.
Itself, the winter is quite cold.
Yeah.
But not East Coast cold.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense because I guess the further inland you go, and it's really not even that far inland. Once you start getting those continental climates rather than the coastal climates that are stabilized by that large body of water.
Exactly. And that's why, and you mentioned it before, and I think this is clever observation too, how sort of lakes and large bodies of water act to, they really act to sort of reflect the temperature and moderate it because they act as stores.
Right.
So the Pacific Ocean's a huge body of water. And so basically the water mixes with, this is me talking science, but the water mixes with the air, and that's what creates some much more mild conditions along the coast and inland where you're dealing with direct sun direct.
Right.
Right.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
Okay. Well, I mean I think that was a very
Sorry for the tangent. But
No, that's exactly the tangent we want because thinking about it when you I'm looking at the globe right here while I'm talking to you, and when you think about it too and you sort of go across over to France and you look at the longitude and latitude, or the latitude I guess is all that really matters in this case, but when you look at the latitudes of this, you're looking at the south of France and how it lines up with like northern Oregon and southern Washington, but France itself is sort of surrounded on both sides by water, which really regulates its temperature, and then you've got the Gulf Stream that comes up and those Gulf winds, they kind of come up and mix in and make the air warmer. So when you're talking about climate as far as the temperature, that's one thing, but then you come in with an additional thing, which is how much sun exposure are you going to get during the different parts of the season, and then that further adds on a complexity. So you've got in Washington, you can go in and get a more extreme climate, or you can be kind of on the coast and get a more temperate climate that's regulated by that large body of water. But in both cases, you're at this between 45 and 48 degrees parallel, that is going to kind of give a similar direct sunlight onto the grapes. Whereas if you go further down into like San Francisco Bay Area and Napa and Sonoma, you're getting more down like direct sunlight, like in how maybe even down, it looks almost it's hard to tell sometimes on the map, but it looks like it's almost lined up with Morocco, not even Spain. It's even further south.
Yeah, it gets Texas, for example. Central Texas is basically aligned with Morocco and India. It's not even aligned with Europe.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And it's a pretty similar climate as well.
Yeah.
The other thing is just it's so easy to forget France, for France, for example, just how big a country it is and how much diversity you're dealing with in terms of climates there as well, even though it's nowhere near the same size as the United States.
Yeah. Well, and even in France, when you just kind of look at the topograph map of it, it does have some pretty interesting topography, we're really getting way off topic here, but
Oh no, this is super on topic. This is basically like you think wine's like tasting and all that. No, it's all topography.
Yeah, because when you start looking at topography and you look at where Loire is, or Bordeaux, or down in the deep south of France, where's Rhone? Because I don't even see that on the map.
Rhone is further south. So northern Rhone is more sort of it's southern France, but it's not really southern France. It's just south of Lyon, but it goes down all the way to Montpellier, Marseille area.
Okay. Oh, I see that. Yeah.
On sort of the end.
So it's it's sort of more interior, more closer to the Mediterranean than it is to the Atlantic.
Oh yeah, much more. So that's why the Rhone and Bordeaux are so different. The Rhone is a lot hotter climate than Bordeaux. Bordeaux's much more mild and kind of a little humid too. Okay. Bordeaux's a little bit like New Jersey without the cold winter.
I think you and I talked about this online a little bit, Jackson, and maybe I might
Jersey wine people.
Well, that's right. And also, I think I mentioned it to you, Mason. And actually, I talked to somebody about it online, but that there was that I've been starting to kind of get into Rhone Pinot Noir a little bit because it's
Rhone Pinot Noir?
No, I'm sorry. Burgundy Pinot Noir, I think. Hold on.
Yeah.
Burgundy, yeah. So where is Burgundy in relation to this?
So Burgundy is north of the Northern Rhone. So basically, are you guys familiar with France geographically?
Well, I'm looking at it on a map.
I'm looking at it on a map right now. I'm not naturally this good. Basically, when you go north of Lyon, you get to Macon is the next big city, and Macon sort of represents Beaujolais.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Is sort of, and once you go north of Macon, you get Macon is where you start getting Burgundian varieties.
Yeah.
South of Macon, Beaujolais, Macon's where you start getting Burgundian varieties, and Burgundy kind of ends at Dijon, but it also goes way up into Chablis, which is much more close to Champagne than it is to Burgundy. But that's a side note.
Okay, yeah, I've been lately kind of exploring Burgundy Pinot Noir and then Beaujolais mixed reds or red blends, which
they're entirely gamay.
They're super unusual, and the ones in Beaujolais and very hit or miss, not consistent at all.
Yeah.
It's very weird.
I feel the exact same way. A lot of it is a sub-region for Beaujolais. Beaujolais produces great wine, but it also produces complete plonk.
Yeah. Okay.
So Beaujolais, like with Beaujolais, you have to look for the sub-region. If it just says Beaujolais, nothing else, you're probably not going to get you're not going to get a great wine.
Okay.
You have to look for Morgon, Fleuret. So I'm blanking out on the village names. But Morgon and Fleuret are the most famous, and those are sort of the more full-bodied, more Pinot Noir-like examples of it. Whereas Beaujolais Nouveau and Standard Beaujolais, they use carbonic maceration,
right?
Which is the process where they add, basically they prevent they put a weight on top of the grapes to prevent the carbon dioxide from seeping down into the grapes. And what that does is it preserves a lot of the more fruity bubblegum-like qualities. So if you have a bad Beaujolais, and some people like this, you'll kind of smell like banana and bubblegum on it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And that's because when you don't allow any sort of carbon dioxide touch the grapes or the juice at all, and that's the process of carbonic maceration, or you limit the amount. What it does is it preserves more of the original fruit-like qualities, sort of like, this is a bad example, but it's a little bit like making a jam. You know how you make a jam and you preserve the fruit-like qualities because you're putting it into an airtight container? It's a little like that.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, and that's probably a good segue for us to go ahead and for Mason. Mason, you did a Portuguese wine today too, didn't you?
I did. Yes.
Okay. Why don't we get into your wine, because I've also got a Portuguese wine, and the Portuguese wine regions seem to be divided up even more heavily, and I want to get into that a little bit with you, Jackson, before we get into the EU stuff, just because it seems very complicated, and it maybe is not as complicated as I think, but let's go ahead and do your wine, Mason. I'll do mine, and then we'll get into that.
Yeah, so I have the winery, I think, is Pinhel, which is Pinhel, Encostas do Tinto. So it's Tinto is what they, for Spanish or Portuguese for red. So this one I got in a Groupon pack from Splash Wines from my parents for my birthday. So I got, 8 reds, 8 whites, 2 rosés. So when Jacob said he was doing a Portuguese wine, I went, well, maybe I have one. This one happened to be Portuguese. Very dark ruby in color, dark purple, kind of like a garnet color. Pretty tannic, so very kind of dry to the mouth. Good berry flavor. The ratings on this, where I could find ratings for it, because it's, it was very hard to find anything about it, really. Wasn't super strong. Now the back is in Portuguese and English, so they have a lot of, kind of descriptions of what's going on, and they kind of try to give you like an idea of what it is, but they don't do a great job of fully describing it. It's 13% alcohol by volume, but it's great because it has one of our favorite things, Jacob, to see on a wine is like a regional stamp. So I think this is probably a government stamp, but you and I are kind of like, oh, they should have for like, authenticity sort of things, as opposed to, these government enforced ones have a stamp saying kind of like where it's from. So,
right.
Yeah. And I'm with you on that.
Yes. And so then, the grape blend is Rufiti, Torgia, Franca, and then Tinta Rosé, or Roriz, which is like a Tempranillo, but the Portuguese version of it. And then the other two I'm not super familiar with, but they do go into port, which I think we've talked about them before, Jacob.
Yeah.
Or at least kind of,
Roriz, Tinta Quinto, Tinta... What are the other ones on it? Basically, Portuguese, besides a few famous grapes, it's largely very heavily blended together. Though.
That's what I was reading online, was that up until really the last 40 or 50 years, everything's very, very heavily blended and mostly drinking locally unless it's put into port. And that's kind of that's sort of what is going to be part of our topic, is kind of what's going on with the modern history of Portugal, because it's opened up quite a bit. But that's Mason, you messaged him the wines in the chat, right?
Yeah, the grapes, yeah. Rufiti, Tranquilla Franca, and Tinta Roriz.
Roriz,
yeah, that's what.
Yeah, Roriz.
Yeah, so it would be Rufite, Torriga Franca, Tinta Roriz, which is Tempranillo. Yeah, it's in what region in Portugal did you say it was from again?
This one, hang on a second. I did a bunch of research on that, and then now I'm just the Coa River area, which isn't super large, but the Vino region, Terras da Bahia.
Bahia. Oh, that's surprising. So, Bahia is south of, or is it? Bahia is north. But
yeah, this is northern.
No, northern Portugal. I was thinking in relation to the Douro River as a whole.
Yeah, this is a tributary of it. It actually flows south to north, or north to south.
Yeah, the Bahia region they produce some very structured reds there, and they're super age-worthy, the ones in Portugal I've had. I've rarely seen them in the U.S. at all, actually. So that's somewhat surprising.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen anything from Splash Wines.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them, but I haven't.
Yeah, they seem to be the only ones that I could find that like carried it. And then even on their site, like this one was a 2016. They only had the 2014 available on the site, and they didn't really kind of give you a whole lot of details on it. But the package that I got was their Splash Wines Best of 2018, and so far we've had a Tuesday Night Red and this Spanish or this Portuguese one. They've all been very good, but Jacob, you would like this. The Tuesday Night Red is a Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's kind of sweet, but like not in a like disgusting way.
Okay, sweet like more like in fruity, or sweet as in like sweet like sugary.
In between.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it isn't like it's definitely cheap wine, but it's not like that disgustingly like mass produced cheap taste.
Got it. Okay.
It was really interesting.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So now, Mason, did you say what the alcohol was on that?
13%.
13%? Okay. So I've actually got one from a different part of Portugal. So we actually went over the name earlier, and I'm going to try it one more time. So Rapariga Da Quinta. So that's what I'm going to go with. Mine's 14.5% alcohol by volume. It is in. Let me grab my bottle again, because for some reason I always set it behind me, and it's always very difficult for me to reach. But it's from. My guess is this is a more general region, because when I look it up, it just shows a gigantic red splotch on the south of Portugal, but not including the most southern part, and it's
Alentejo.
Alentejo. Okay, so Alentejo. And I think I told you this, Jackson, before we started recording. You recommended this to me because I said, hey, I got this 20% off coupon at Total Wine. I'd like to pick up some Portuguese wines. What do you recommend? You recommend 2 different Portuguese wines that they had. I liked this one the best of the 2, and so now I'm on my second bottle of this one. And I thought it was very good. I went and picked up another one this weekend because I had another coupon and was like, well, I'm going to go get more stuff. So, and then I decided to do the Portugal episode. So this one is made. I'm going to try this the same way Mason did, the grapes are Alicante Bouchette Aragonese.
It's a French mass production grape.
Okay, and then Aragonese,
or it's Spanish, but it's often used in France. Aragonese, it's a Portuguese name for, I think, Mencia.
Okay, and you know what? Aragonese that's
Tempranillo, actually.
it's Tempranillo. Okay, that now isn't Aragon? Wasn't that one of the kingdoms that ended up coming together with Castile to make Spain?
100%, and that's where it originated from.
Okay,
a lot of Grenache originated from there, and the names changed when it went to other names. So Aragonese sort of refers to the past geographical origin.
Okay, that's interesting because I recognize that part, and I was like, huh. And I think actually, Mason, you and I discussed that was Tempranillo, and this might be one of the reasons why I like it so much because I like that style of grapes. And then the last one is Rapariga Nacional, which I guess is like the Portuguese national grape.
Yep.
And there's a lot of that in port. And
that's sort of their basically when they're trying to make their sort of cult wines. That's sort of the grape they're pushing for the most. That's sort of their Cabernet Sauvignon, if you want to think about it in California terms, if you will.
Okay. All right. Well, that's nice.
But it is more blended.
Okay. So this is actually, that's the smallest percentage. I actually have the percentages here. It's of the first one, the Alicante Bouchette, 52%, Aragonés 27%, and Torriga Nacional is 21%. So not a bad, not an unusual blend. Does seem to be like a general blend. Now, I'll go ahead and go over real quick the smell and the taste and my conclusion on it. So the aroma or nose or whatever is ripe red fruit. It does have a hint of mineraliness to it, so it's kind of like a gravelly mineral smell. The taste is a very, very strong fruit flavor, but it's dry, so it's not. And I've gone over this a couple of times on the show. There's a difference between fruitiness and sweet. It's not sweet because it is a dry wine. The sugar has been metabolized by the yeast, but it does have a lot of strong fruit flavors. But it's in this one, it's just kind of not a particular fruit, but it's just a ripe red fruit flavor. Maybe ripe plum, ripe black cherry, that sort of thing. It's sort of got a jamminess to it as well, like a kind of like a wild berry jam. Very soft tannins, medium body. Definitely has tannins, but it's very soft tannins. It's not like a Cabernet Sauvignon or one of those more like grippy wines. Very medium bodied, and it also has a very slight mineraliness to it. Then there's another thing to this, and I've noticed this with the other Portuguese wine as well, and also this Argentinian Malbec that I had the other day. It's not carbonated at all, but there is something about the flavor that reminds me of it being carbonated, and I would imagine that's acidity because it's a texture on my tongue, but I can't really point it out. But it's something very interesting. If either of you guys ever have it, if you can pick that up as well, I think it's interesting. And I've only had 2 or 3 that are like that so far, but it's definitely something that sticks out to me. And I had it in this Argentinian Malbec the other day, or Malbec, however you say it, and I was like, wow, like this reminds me so much of this Portuguese one. And then I had this Portuguese one again, and it reminded me of that again. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. It's like this hint of carbonation, and even though it's not carbonated, so it's something about that texture. So my conclusion on this was, I think of the 2 Portuguese that I've had, both of which you recommended, Jackson. This one is definitely my favorite. I think it goes really well with food. I had this earlier today with this like beef and mushroom. It's like a goulash, I guess, that I made. It's like a stir fried goulash that I make sometimes. That's
goulash is underrated.
Yeah, I mean, I make a lot of stuff like that. So it's just kind of like beef bouillon, and then you cook the beef in the beef bouillon, and then you take the beef out, and then you put in mushrooms and onions and ghee and some paprika, some black pepper, some salt, and then just kind of like thicken it up until it's a gravy, and then you put it all back together.
Yeah, I do a different method for goulash, but it's somewhat similar.
Yeah.
Cut down a ton of onions and paprika, throw in game. Game is best if you can get a hold of it, but beef works too. Yeah. And cook it for 4 hours. Over a fire, and you're like in Hungarian.
Yeah, it's good. Well, it's like poor man's goulash, because I usually make it in about 30 minutes, but it's pretty good, and my wife likes it, and that's what I like. Good. But for casual drinking, or just having this with like a casual meal like that, I think it's really good, and also just kind of for like sitting and watching TV, which is when I normally have a glass of wine. Is when we're kind of done with the day, I have a glass of wine and we watch a show or something like that. I think this one's perfect for that. It's not overpowering. overpowering in any way. It's not so complex that you have to pay attention to it, but it's just good drinking and it tastes good. And that's my conclusion of it. You got any thoughts, either one of you, on that?
Oh yeah,
No,
this
that's
might
good.
help you. Like, not that I should be helping, but like just a way of kind of looking at some of these Portuguese wines that you guys might find pretty interesting is that if you look at Alentejo, and I have my Google Maps pulled up just like you, I kind of knew this before, but it's actually quite similar to Sacramento in climate.
Oh, really? Okay, that's my
region,
place.
So it just kind of helps to know like a local, equivalent, right? But it's a very hot part of Portugal. They make some really good wines. I've had some of the best wines I've had out of there, and are actually Cabernet Sauvignon blends.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm normally quite against that, but the ones I've had out of there could rival, Napa Cabs in many ways, and I was really impressed by them. So it's in a really interesting region. A lot of it's bulk production still. A lot of it's still the wine co-ops, which I'm sure you want to get into a little later in terms of how big an impact that's had on Portugal. But there's progress being made. It's hot, but you can still make good wine.
Yeah. Well, and it looks like it's a very large region, and I noticed that it looks to me like a big reservoir on the map. I remember reading about how they used to get these grapes and then they would like ship them down the river in these like really cool big flat boats, and it was like is that not here? Is that somewhere else in Portugal?
That's entirely on the Douro River.
Oh, okay.
So that's like the famous port is if you go to Porto, you see these, it's mainly for tourists, the stage, but it's still kind of cool to look at because the wineries like to maintain it. They have these kind of old, like 18th century style boats that they still carry the barrels of port over on. And it's a little bit of a gimmick, but it's still kind of cool. Okay. Alentejo is much different of a region. Alentejo, the highest elevation is only about 2,000 feet, and that's more interior. Okay. It's closer. It's more of a coastal plain. That's where a lot of Portugal's rice production is. So Sacramento isn't actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's like everything you're describing is exactly like Sacramento. So huge rice paddies. Like where I'm from near Sacramento is about 2,000 feet elevation. And there's a whole bunch of about 2,000 feet elevation, but then it just comes down in the valley and it's just flat. Lots of like a lot of rice paddies, a lot of fruit orchards, a lot of nuts and things like that, like nuts and apricots and plums and olives and all of those types of things, all grown in that area. It's a fantastic region in the world for agriculture, those sort of regions, because if you can irrigate and you have flat land and you can grow fruit, you can grow citrus, you are in a very good situation for large scale agriculture. Problem is quality, like, as you're aware in the Central Valley, not everybody there, but quality is often adversely affected by sort of the easy productive standards. It's just economics. Right. Yeah. I mean, when you have a region like that, sometimes this is something that I learned recently that the Texas High Plains had a issue with for a long time until recently, was that because it was so fertile and so easy to just grow tons and tons and tons of grapes, they were just growing basically garbage grapes and then selling them for bulk wine.
And this is a fantastic segue if you want to go into the
let's do that.
EU wine pull-out schemes and regulations, because this is what it's about, is sort of them saying, we know about quality wine, but, it's complicated. Obviously, I don't support the EU, but I hate to admit it, they have made wines better. Okay. In certain regions, in certain areas. Certain regions, they've made them worse. But in certain areas, the vine pull-out schemes have worked.
Okay. So
but it's true.
Yeah. So one thing that I thought was interesting when doing research for this episode, and this was true in Portugal, and this was also true in Sicily, was that prior to the EU coming in and sort of breaking these up, there was a whole bunch of these state-owned co-ops, and this is actually Now, granted, this is sort of a feather in the cap of the EU, but it's also a feather in the cap of the anti-statists, is that you get they're basically communist grape growers or socialist grape growers, where you have these huge co-ops where nobody really cares that much about the quality. They're not really interested in changing up their ways of doing it. They're producing very poor wine. And even when people were coming in to try to do something different and change it up a little bit, these co-ops were so large and they had so much state influence that it was very difficult for independent producers to get anywhere, because they would just get blocked by regulations and by the bureaucrats coming in and helping out the state-owned co-ops. And that is one of the things that the EU kind of came into Portugal and did was and it's very controversial too, because there was a lot of very isolated regions, I guess, in Portugal where it was very difficult for them to get the wines out. So they're still finding these, they're not exactly lost grapes or unknown grapes, but they're kind of like unusual mutations that are in these isolated regions of Portugal that didn't have any road access prior to the EU coming in and building roads everywhere. So they were growing all these field varietals where it was just kind of like whatever's in the field mixes up. It makes these unusual grapes and then also they're calling them things that are completely different than what other people are calling them. And they're at these different elevations or just in isolated valleys in different places. I mean, if you look at the topograph map of Portugal, it's very mountainous, and you can totally see a lot of these places, kind of like Mason, like West Virginia, where there's like all these isolated valleys and stuff like that. In West Virginia, Portugal seems like it's got a lot of that going on as well.
It's West Virginia times 200.
Yeah.
It's much. The map, you get taller, you get more extreme mountains, and it's a much more isolated region because the region of Spain, besides Galicia, which is quite fertile, but even there it's mountainous. The region of Spain near Portugal is the poorest, worst region of Spain to be in. So basically it was quite isolated on the border, besides when the Spanish at one point decided, let's just take it over for, 100 years. But it's super isolated in that part of Portugal.
Well, and you can kind of, what we were talking about earlier with the mountains blocking the coastal weather or whatever. Portugal looks like it's a really good example of that, because once you get onto the eastern portion of Portugal where you're in Spain, that's basically where the mountains end, and you get into this kind of unfertile, dry area. And so that's sort of like a really good example of where the topography can kind of block a lot of the moisture coming in and make it very difficult to grow things there unless you can get a lot of irrigation in, but I don't even know what the soil's like there.
All right, so 2 points real quick. Jacob.
Yeah.
There's no I. It's topography.
What am I calling it?
Typography or something close to that.
I think I'm saying topography or topography.
It's topography.
How am I saying it? Topography.
I can't say it that way. It's very funny the way you're saying it. I love it, but it's topography. There's no I.
Topography. Wait, hold on. Let me try it again real quick. Hold on. Topography.
Yeah, topography.
Topography. I'm going to go back to saying it the other way.
Typography.
I probably will.
Yeah, it's like you're putting an I in the front, so it's like typography. But
okay.
So I was trying to figure out how. So one of the things that is always so interesting to me, the idea that there were places in Portugal, which you think old world Portugal, you don't think the Portuguese are rich like the Germans, but if you told me there's a place in Germany that they had unknown varietals of grapes, I'd be like, bullshit. And that's the size of Montana. Portugal's about 35,000 square miles. So I was trying to figure out what was a good state comparison. So I was like, well, let me look up Delaware. Delaware was way dwarfed by Portugal, but our friend that we just talked about that was Portugal was 2 times in the isolation, West Virginia. West Virginia is about 2 times the size of Portugal. So you know how big West Virginia is? Yeah. Portugal's about 2 times the size, or is about half the size.
Wow, really? Half the size of West Virginia?
Yeah, West Virginia is about 65,000 or 62,000. Oh, wait, no, excuse me. I was reading kilometers instead. Portugal is actually, completely wrong. Portugal's about 11,000 square miles larger.
Okay. Oh, okay. So they're rough. So. They're so it's a little bit larger. Okay,
like Ohio, maybe. It's a little bigger.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, and it's very long too. So you're gonna get a very differing. But you're right though, Mason, because that is interesting. But I was watching an episode of X-Files, which is one of my favorite shows. And they had that episode where this dude from West Virginia who knows how to do
Pennsylvania.
It's about the same size as Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but up until 1950s, 1960s, there were still people who were completely isolated in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this is where I guess the controversy comes in, Jackson, and you can speak to this a little bit, is what I've been reading about it is that the EU came in, and not specifically with their wine programs and stuff like that, but they came into Portugal and places like Sicily and these kind of more mountainous, more underdeveloped nations, and they came in, they basically just built roads everywhere. And that has changed a lot of the wine industry in Portugal in particular, because before, a lot of these isolated areas were not accessible, or it was very difficult to get to them. And you'd have, generations of people living up there, and maybe they'd come down once in a while, and they had probably electricity and stuff like that, but they weren't really in contact that much with the outside world. And their main way of transportation was either riding out on horses or something like that, or coming down a river. And now they've got roads that go everywhere, and that changes things. And so the controversy that I've heard about or read about is that a lot of what the locals, the people who are into the traditional winemaking, which isn't necessarily the better way of making wine, but it's the way that they've been doing it for a long time. What they're upset about is that you've got these EU-backed programs coming in and building roads, and then coming in and tearing out a lot of these old field varietal grapes and planting noble grapes. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, all of these types of things, trying to do what's marketable as opposed to what Portugal has been doing for a really long time. And this is one of those things where this is the controversy, I guess, is just because you've been doing it for a really long time doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. But then on the flip side of that is the EU promoting something that is marketable, or is it promoting something that it thinks is marketable, but the people maybe could be able to take a bigger risk? But then again, you've got another layer of complexity going on here, which is the EU did come in and it did end a lot of these state-owned co-ops, which were doing things very, very poorly. And that opened the market up a little bit for smaller wine producers to come in and start trying things that were different and better and higher quality.
Yeah, so there's two different things going on here at once, and I think it's important to distinguish them. My view is I'm not an EU guy, but if I could flip a switch and turn the U.S. federal government into the EU, I actually would, because you do have a lot more autonomy in Spain versus France than you do in Texas versus South Dakota, right?
Okay.
But there's two things going on here. On one hand, you have sort of the smaller farmers who are growing grapes and it's not just grapes, it's food, it's pork, it's the fishermen too are really affected by this. It's EU quotas, and basically what they do is they say, oh, you should only produce this much amount, and we're going to stop you if you produce more than this. It's not exactly, it's a quality control, but not exactly. And then the other scenario was the grape pullout schemes that sort of emerged in the 80s and 90s. And that came, largely to address basically the Spanish and Portuguese wine industries were basically a form, either co-ops or grand noble estates, because who ran Portugal and Spain before the EU sort of took control for the most part? It was, who it was. It was fascists, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was who was the big fascist dictator who took over Spain right around World War II?
You had Franco and Salazar. Salazar was worse than Franco.
But wasn't Franco in control until the 70s?
Mm-hmm. And Salazar was as well. Portugal kept their colonies in Africa and drafted Portuguese guys. I talked to a lot of Portuguese guys about this.
Okay.
They drafted these guys to fight in African wars in Angola and Mozambique in the mid-70s. Imagine that. And you're the poorest country in Europe. Your income is the same as Mexico when you're being drafted to defend 400-year-old colonies in Africa.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
Huh. So, I mean, that does make it even more the complexity of what's going on with the EU. And wine is a really interesting way to explore this, too, because you've also got, and this is sort of aside because we're going to get into this EU document in a minute. One of the other things that I was reading about that I had no idea about this, that apparently Sicily is still heavily controlled by the mafia. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea about that. And apparently that's been one of the most difficult things about Sicilian wine, is that everybody has to pay this mafia tax. And in addition to having to pay all their regular government taxes. And so people just don't really want to open up a winery there. It's too risky. Or the mafia has been taking their payments from these older estates or these co-ops for a long time. And so they're just we're not letting anybody else come in here. And even the government has to deal with them a lot, because they're just entrenched. They've been there forever. And super interesting.
It's really interesting. I think it's a bit over-exaggerated, because there's a ton of new Sicilian wineries opening up. There's a ton of new business happening in Sicily.
Yeah, well, that's what the article I was reading was saying, that a lot of that is due to the EU. Is that the EU just kind of came in and went, we don't really care about your tradition. We're building roads everywhere. And
I don't buy that.
Okay, all right.
Just the reason why is, I think when I look at Italy and you look at the history of Italy, every single region of Italy produced a significant amount of wine throughout large periods of time. Mm-hmm. Mafia in Sicily is an issue. Mafia is going to extort you for money. How much is the mafia really going to extort you for money? It's a very, very minimal amount compared to the Italian federal government, if you really want to look into it. It's shitty and it's scary.
Right.
I think there's a lot of emphasis put on that. Sicily has a murder rate that would rival Vermont for lowest in the U.S. It's not people have this crazy impression of how the mafia works there.
Okay.
I'd pick the mafia over, Seattle, central government. I think it's a little exaggerated.
Well,
I have a friend who's from Sicily. Like, his mom is Sicilian, and he lived back in Sicily. It's one of those things where, like, the mob, it's kind of like the Yakuza in Japan. They take their toll and things like that, but a lot of times they end up being very useful in keeping certain things, and that can be enforcement of not opening the new wineries and things like that. But there's no way those wineries are opening just because the EU said so. Like, Sicily is severely screwed up in that. The mob found a way to make money on those, and they're profiting from them. So I imagine it was some very well greased and timed palms.
Okay, that probably makes sense. But
someone
anyway,
I knew. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, someone I knew ended up running into the mob and had a great time.
Well, I mean, like a lot of
she was backpacking the country for like 3 weeks. Somebody got sick and lost, and they had to go to the local mobster's house, and they fed them well for 5 days and kept them company and entertained them, because you have sort of an obligation to help those who are lost in that area. So it's not all bad.
Well, and that's one of the things that this article was talking about, was that a lot of it is it's tradition, but mostly what they were talking about was that, like, so somebody was trying to open up a wine tourism business there, where they would basically have like buses that would just take you around Sicily to try all the wines. And she said one of the things that was interesting, because they had an outside investor investing with locals or people from the island, and one of the things that they thought was interesting was that people from the island were like, and we've got to make sure that we reserve 3% or 4% or whatever for our payment to these mafia groups. And the outside investor was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, no, we need to pay it. It's just not worth the hassle. We'll just go ahead and pay it. And they were like, the outside investors were like freaking out about it. They were like, how is this a thing or whatever? But the overall argument of the thing was that the EU coming in and basically modernizing has made it so that it's just more difficult for the mafia to do business there, which, take that one way or the other. I'm not disagreeing with either one of you guys, but one thing that I think, Mason, you and I, and maybe Jackson, you'd be interested in trying this, is eventually if we could get some wines from the Etna region, which I guess is like
they're fantastic.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. They're supposed to be really good, and they have like this volcanic soil there and it's an active volcano, and you can
super high elevation in some areas too, so you get quite a bit of acidity as well.
Oh, Jacob, I wish I had known, because I had a Sicilian.
Oh, really? Okay.
Wine in that pack.
Oh,
I have no idea. Like, here's the thing: I'm not degrading. I'm not being derogatory to splash wines.
Yeah,
but it wasn't like a $500 wine subscription or something like that. They make they generally have lower tier wine, so I have to imagine, like, it's still probably good. It's just like, I don't know if it would be in this area.
Okay, well, let's get back to Portugal, because we're already running long, or not. We're not really running long, but I keep going off on these like side things. We still got.
I think it's my fault for the most part.
No.
That's us, man.
That's us. Yeah, that's definitely us. But so let's just go ahead and do like a brief history, Jackson, of Portugal. Let's start in like maybe 1900. So like since 1900, what has been their major export wine? What has been available to the rest of the world and been promoted for the rest of the world? And then maybe, I guess this would be late 80s when they joined the EU, or 86, is that when they joined the EU? I don't know for sure. And then
I think it was 86.
Okay. All right, Jackson. So you want to go ahead and give us a brief summary for the last 200 years-ish of Portugal winemaking, so that we can kind of get into our final topic of how the EU has impacted wine production in Portugal.
Yeah, so Portugal has basically grown wine forever, starting with before the Romans, Phoenicians, if you really want to go into it. But basically, wine production in Portugal really became a major export industry. In that during the English Treaty of, I think there was several English treaties. There was actually, I think, 3 or 4 of them where Britain would go to war with France, right?
Right.
And basically, France was a primary source of wine in Britain because you can't really grow grapes in England except the way south of France, and there was only a few people doing it back then.
Okay.
So basically, they had to rely off of Portugal for their wine production, and the wine that worked, because it was a long shipping distance and it worked, it was port, which is fortified.
Yeah.
So that sort of became the basis of the commercial Portuguese wine industry, which is different from the domestic Portuguese wine industry, which is why if you go to port, you see a lot of Graham, Hancocks, Coburns, all of that, very English names, because the English merchants bought places in Portugal and started basically exporting port in the 17th century. And so it kind of continued going on and on like that. That was what port and Madeira, which basically went to the Americas, and that's from an island off of Portugal that Portugal owns. Those sort of became the 2 of the most important wines of the age of exploration, because those were and sherry as well from Spain, because those were all fortified, survived the long ship distance. So that sort of became the basis of the Portuguese wine industry. Was initially fortified wines, and the country was largely producing for domestic consumption quite heavy reds or lighter coastal whites around Vinho Verde, which they grow in a really interesting way as well. So that's sort of the basis of Portugal. Is you have some top red estates, you have a ton of fortified wine for export, made often at very high quality, and then mostly you have peasant wine.
Okay.
Right. And so that sort of is the start of the industry 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, Portugal is a mess. You have you have the liberal revolutions, you have fascist revolutionaries, you have socialist revolutionaries. You have it all in Portugal around this time. But basically, there was a constitution that kicked out the monarch around the late 19th century. And so skipping ahead a lot, Salazar, who's closely related to Franco's school of fascism, if you will, but it's a little bit more like ultra-conservative integralism, but it's complicated. Basically, one of the programs him and his predecessors wanted to do was wine co-ops, because if you think about it and you're a small wine producer, maybe you're a small peasant farmer, you have 10 acres of vines under your name, you want to have the occasional drink and make some money. What do? Wine equipment is extremely expensive, right?
Right.
You say, okay, let's all buy the equipment together. We'll push our grapes in together and make a ton of wine, and it'll be a lot cheaper.
That makes sense.
If you want to have it, if you're trying to make your own, if you couldn't buy you couldn't really buy beer or wine at the store. You kind of have to make your own in an isolated area. That seems like a pretty good idea, doesn't it?
Well, and this is sort of, we have something similar going on in the United States right now, which is like custom crush facilities. But it's like the equipment is owned separately by some company or a vineyard or something like that, and then they try to lease out as much time, because really the equipment's only used really once a year, so it makes sense to try to sort of mitigate the cost or spread it out as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, and
that's one of those things that we need to talk to John about a little bit more. Yeah, because the timing of it, because and I think Jackson can kind of see in this too. Like, one of the things that I always wondered about that custom crush idea is how do you everybody's kind of coming due at the same time. Yeah.
Well, and that's why John was saying that sometimes you've got people who rent out the equipment at 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. So so you've got this 4-hour period where you can put the grapes through to get them destemmed and whatever needs to be done, and then crushed, and then you're quickly trying to get them into your own barrels and your own. Well, I guess they don't go directly into barrels these days. Most of the time, they go into these big concrete things or these big plastic ones, so that you can then ship them back to you. Because then there's also, this is another side tangent, I don't want to get on it too much, but there's also there's a way that taxes work, that if you are putting it into barrels on your own facility, your taxes are lower than if you're putting them into barrels on the facility of the custom crush location. So there's this additional finagling that you have to do to try to figure all that out. But that's kind of what's going on here in Portugal back then, is that people are trying to go look, it's expensive equipment. we're trying to make very large volumes, and so it makes sense to try to come together and do it together.
Mm-hmm. But then the thing is, and we should all point this out, this was partially sort of a local phenomena, and if a group of farmers want to get together, all power to them, right? Mm-hmm. The problem was this was sort of a large phenomena to kind of get farms consolidated together, and it's not exactly communism in a way, but basically when you have farms consolidated into co-ops, if you're a fascist guy and you want to have more control over the society as a large, when you have larger institutions that control more farms, and you have more control.
Yeah.
So it was largely subsidized, encouraged, sometimes forced. The top, pork producers and large companies and the most aristocratic houses got to keep what they had, obvious reasons. It wasn't, an entirely cooperative system, but it was not the problem with co-ops is they make bad wine mostly.
Yeah. Well, I guess it would make sense because it's sort of the same incentive structure as any sort of co-op farm. Is that if all of your produce is going to be mixed together, what's your incentive to take better care of yours? Mm-hmm. If your neighbors, or even if like your neighbor has a vineyard and the terroir affects his grapes in a way that's just going to make him not produce great grapes, and then you've got this really great hill location that's like an awesome slope that's going to get like the sunlight just the way it is, and all the drainage is really good. You've got like a really nice limestone soil that's very rocky or whatever. It puts this really interesting flavor into your wine, and then all of your grapes are getting mixed together with Joe Schmo, who has a valley floor one, and his wine is all sitting in water all the time, and he picks it and it's all like full of water and not a lot of flavor or whatever. So like, what's your incentive? And this is the Misesian insight that us libertarians and free market people are always talking about, is that like humans act based on what they see as their incentive or what they see as their advantage. Whatever.
And one other thing to add to that, if I have a cooperative, a lot of wine is blended. It's just a lot of the best wine is also blended from different vineyards.
Sure.
One of the most expensive, the Grange wines out of Australia, those guys go for $5,000 a bottle, and they're entirely blended from different regions, oftentimes within this just the South Australia region in general, and they can cost a ton of money. So a blend isn't necessarily a bad thing. The problems start to occur when you're trying to look for production over quality, and how big is a co-op? If you and 5 other guys who have vineyards and you want to pitch in for equipment have a co-op, chances are you're not going to have that many problems, You can kind of keep track of each other, police each other, right? But if you have 100, 1,000 different grape producers putting tons of grapes onto it, who can keep track?
Yeah. Well, then it further complicates it too, that in a lot of these co-op farms, a lot of them end up being state owned and state controlled, and then and nobody on who was working them, none of those people actually had any sort of ownership stake in it. They just worked it.
Yeah, Burgundy created a different structure. The free market version, in some ways, is a négociant.
Okay.
And that might interest you. Is basically what the négociant does, and most Burgundy is produced through négociants, although monopoly vineyards and single producers are gaining a lot of popularity. But they basically, because of the Napoleonic inheritance code, Burgundy is super, super balkanized and fractionalized. So you have like 1 acre vineyard, but it could be Grand Cru, and 1 acre vineyard in Grand Cru Burgundy can make a lot of money. So basically, you can't make too many bottles on your own. So you sell to these négociants, and they keep track of which vineyards there are, which version of terroir there are. And they will blend sometimes, but they keep it to the village level, and they buy from different producers from the same Grand Cru or same village level or same valley floor.
Well, I can see an advantage of that too, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately as I get deeper into the wine world. Like, I'm very interested in the business side of wine. As much as I am interested in just like the tasting. It makes a lot of sense to me to have some guy who grows the grapes and is all very hands-on, knows everything about growing grapes, knows about the soil, knows about what he needs to do. He's a farmer. He knows exactly what there is to do about that. But then there's a transition period where you're moving those grapes from that guy to the guy who knows everything there is to know about making wine. And I can see a huge advantage to that, but I can also see the other side of it, and this makes a lot of sense to me too, where you've got the guy who owns a vineyard, spends a lot of time with the grapes, cares a lot about the grapes, but then also once it's harvest time, then transitions it and does the winemaking himself, and also knows that. I can see both sides of that. So I've been reading a lot into like Texas wines and stuff lately, and one of the things that's very common here is there are people who own vineyards and they don't make wine, and they sell all of their grapes to Lolano Estacado or somewhere like that. Some large company in Texas that makes wine. Yeah, basically the Negociant, and they go out, they go look at the grapes, they go check out the vineyards, and they go like, oh, we want to use these grapes to make this wine, and we want to use these other ones to make the shitty wine, but we want to use these to make this really good wine. And like I've talked about this on the show before. Like I've had like a whole 180 on Lolano Estacado. They have such a bizarre range of quality in their wine. Like their regular old Tempranillo, however you say it.
Tempranillo,
yeah, it's awful. Like, I don't like their regular one. But their Tempranillo Reserve is one of the best ones I've had. So I'm like, how are these so different? And when you go and like dig into it, one of them is just like a whole bunch of vineyards and they mix them together. The other one is like they went and selected these High Plains vineyards specifically because they do these grapes well. And it's the reserve. They treated it very well. The other ones is just like, yeah, we just kind of like did these ones and here it is.
Found on the side of the road.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
Porcupine got in the crusher.
Yeah,
and it didn't die, but it did crap everywhere.
Right. Well, and I also like recently I had their GSM and the Lolano Estacado GSM, which I guess is done.
You didn't Grenache in that one, did you?
No, like that one. It was okay, but like the price for it, I was like, they really need to change the order of these grapes, because like I've had their Syrah before, and the S in GSM is Syrah, and their Syrah is good. So I was like, well, they need to just put more Syrah in, and then kind of reframe it and make it more structured by adding what is it? It's what's the G and the M in GSM?
Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So more, they need to like turn. I'm not a winemaker. I don't know, but like I feel like they need to up the S. They need to decrease the G and the M.
I think Texas is making more wine than they should. I really don't. I think other than a few sub-regions in Texas and people making it for fun, I don't think Texas should largely be making wine. I've kind of come to that conclusion.
I haven't had many Texas wines, but I think this is the classic, and I think this should bring us back closer to the not article but the white paper, because that's what it is, Jacob. It's a white paper technically. To what we have on hand is, I don't necessarily think that Texas is it's kind of like that area of Portugal where, and so I think this is kind of a preserve.
Oh, that area of Portugal is a far that's 10 times better region for growing.
No. I don't disagree with you, but what I mean is like, so one of the things is there's a difference between the ability to do something, and we've talked about this on this episode, the ability to do something compared to the skill of doing something. Mm-hmm. Like, you look at certain Chinese products and you're like, the same factory makes an iPhone and then it produces like this cheap Indian one, goes to India, and you're like, it barely charges, and the Indian guy's like, this is amazing. So, and whereas you're like, my iPhone broke. And it's like, what do you mean? It's like, well, it just won't turn on. It's like, well, did you charge it? No. Well, so we have this thing where like, I don't know if Texas is necessarily putting its best foot forward, because the people who are currently making wines in Texas may not be the most skilled for that area. Well, but because of the perverse incentive and structures and things like that in the U.S. and grants and things like that, now like there's somebody we're going to hopefully talk to later who's making wine in Texas, or trying to make wine in Texas, who is dedicated to the art of making wine. Yeah. So
well, and that I don't want to go too far off on this because we do want to get back to that white paper. But one of the things, Jackson, I'll tell you this, and maybe I should send you a Texas wine that I think is very good, just so you can try it out. But
I've had a few good ones. I'm being a little facetious, but
sure. Well, what it is it seems to me, and I've been reading into this a lot lately, because it's so diverse. It's like they've got really, really terrible wine and they have really good wine. I'm like, why is it so different? And so I've been reading a bunch about it, and one of the things is that up until like 95, 96, the mid 90s, all of the wine that was made in Texas up until the 70s was bulk grape growing, and they sold it, and it was used to make just like Thunderbird or whatever they were, whatever
Is redneck wine.
Yeah, exactly. Redneck wine. Which, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you like, but it's not high quality. And then I guess in the 70s, they started having some people come in and go like, well, no, let's see what we can do here. It's fertile. The climate's not terrible. Let's see what we can do. And then they started making a lot of the noble grapes and stuff like that. But the reason they were doing that was because they were hiring consultants, and all the consultants were out of California. So the consultants were coming in, they were going like, oh, you want to make wine? We'll tell you what to make that sells really well from California.
Which is a perfect segue into this paper, Jacob.
It is a perfect segue. And so they were doing that, but that's not necessarily what grows really well in Texas. And one of the things they discovered in the late 80s, early 90s is that Tempranillo and Viognier do fairly well here. And now they're starting to expand into other ones that they just really never thought that much about making in Texas until people started taking tours of Europe and going like, but Tempranillo was a good example of this. Somebody took like a business trip or whatever to Spain, and they were looking for like cattle to mix with their cattle here in Texas. And while they were there, they spent a couple of days looking at cattle, and then they went on to taste wine, and they were like, holy crap, like the region, this climate is very similar to the High Plains region. Why aren't we making Tempranillo? And because these people had a small vineyard, and they were growing, normal French things, Cabernet, Merlot, Syrah, that type of thing, and they were doing okay. But what they discovered was that this is not really the best climate for those grapes. They need to find grapes that really, really like Texas, because Texas is a weird place.
You need a later ripening grape.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hot here. It's really hot. Like it gets up to 105.
Tempranillo is actually an early ripening grape.
Yeah, but if you let it go for a long time, you're going to get a much more sugar, a lot higher alcohol content, and a lot more of those fruity flavors. And then if you treat it correctly during the fermentation process, you're going to get a lot of that oak flavor transition to it. And so
Tempranillo is a little interesting because
no, go ahead.
The region in Spain, sort of that Castile Leon, actually gets quite cold, and it actually has to be somewhat cold hardy as well, Tempranillo, because you get freezes in that part of Spain.
Well, and what's weird about here is you get late spring freezes here too, and because it's this weird continental, not here meaning the Dallas area, but the High Plains area, you get these continental temperatures which have these kind of wild swings, and it's just very strange. So you need these very hardy grapes, but you also need grapes that produce good wine. But Mason, what was the transition that you wanted to do back to the white paper? Because we've got maybe 10 minutes longer, and
so our main focus tonight has been on Portugal and Texas. So there are some. If you look at pictures of Portugal, you could be like, that's Texas, except for the mountains, like the high mountains of Portugal. But what I was trying to say is we were talking about kind of in the break and before, we took a break. So those who don't know, magic of podcasting, we did take a break. But where people were coming in and kind of showing the Portuguese, here are these wine varieties that sell. Whereas the Portuguese are like, well, I don't have any experience in this wine. I don't know how to use it. So we have this paper that the EU put out where it was a study where basically the EU bureaucrats, and maybe not the bureaucrats, but I think the EU, a lot more than the United States, has a mandate to present statistical information that what they were doing was actually relevant.
Yeah.
So the EU had a plan, policy, some sort of guidelines in, I think it was 2008 to 2013 was the period that was specifically covered by the paper, where they were talking about this was 2014, 2018. I can't remember exactly.
No, I think you're right on the first one, because the paper's from 2014, and I think they're in a new period right now. And they don't have
2014 begins the new period.
Yeah.
So they're trying to assess this plan of action they had on trying to get areas like member states to put money into the wine regions to develop them, but not in the Jacob, you have a successful winery. Mason does not. Mason literally can't make his operating costs. You, Jacob, you're selling your wine locally. You're doing okay, but they were trying to get the member states to fund you to expand your reach, whereas not necessarily fund me to keep me in operations. They're like, hey, let the bad ones die. And which we know the government never does anything like that. But it's like trying to herd a bunch of chickens and watching the EU bureaucrats get pissed because they're trying to herd chickens.
Sure. So. Yeah. And that does seem, Jackson, I don't know if you had a chance to look at this white paper. I just thought it was very interesting.
I took a quick look, and it is sort of the EU talking points, but
yeah. Well, it does seem to be the EU this was actually way more harsh than I expected a EU paper to be. I kind of
surprise you, man.
I've been getting very surprised by the EU lately because it is a huge bureaucracy, but they do seem to have a lot more savvy than I expected.
Like the problem with the EU is they're obviously people who can't mind their own business, but they're a lot smarter than the same people in the US who have the same role.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. That's what it seems like. So this paper, to just kind of sum it up real quick, Mason, it's basically it covers what the EU had been trying to do to promote the wine region. Then it covers that it failed and mostly the failure was that it just was giving money to the people who shouldn't have been getting money. And then it kind of has some policy prescriptions for what maybe they should do in the next period. So the biggest problem, and you kind of addressed this already, Mason, what it seemed like the biggest problem was that they were giving money to the governments and with the expectation that the governments were going to help out the wineries that were doing well and just kind of help the wineries that were not doing well kind of go away. And what ended up happening instead was the people who probably shouldn't have gotten the money were getting a lot of the money, and the people who should have or who were doing well just kept going on their own and doing whatever they were doing before.
And also got money.
Yeah, and also got money, but it was just kind of like a non-thing. Now, one of the things that they don't really address too much in this paper, although it's mentioned a couple of times, not really directly, but sort of elusively, is, and Jackson, you can kind of allude to this, is that one of the things that the EU seems to both love and hate is preserving local character, because it's so important to Europe, as ridiculously diverse as Europe is. You know, people don't really think about this in Europe, particularly Americans, because we just kind of see Europe as Europe. But it's so incredibly diverse, and then it's diverse down to like the valleys, down to like this tiny region here where like these guys are making this cheese that is different than this other cheese. Like there's this famous quote about a guy who, or I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's like about like if France was divided up by like the number of cheeses that they make, it would be like several thousand countries or something like that.
A better one would be just how many grapes there are in Italy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just the number of grapes and genetically different, and also handled differently, the traditions and stuff like that. But, you know, again, and the paper does kind of go to this a little bit, is it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And the whole point of these programs, and this is a government program, so take it as, you know, we're not sympathetic. None of us, neither one of us, none of the three of us are sympathetic to the state coming in and doing stuff. But the whole purpose of the state in this case, or to the EU in this case, was to interact with the local governments and the state and the country governments, the national governments, and give them some money so that they could improve their wine industry for export. And that seems to have worked a little bit, but it also served to waste a lot of money on wineries that were not doing very well. So kind of, Jackson, to pass this back to you, and this is something because you're getting into the wine import and export business. And we'll kind of end on this because we are really running short on time. But in the region of Portugal that you're interested in, do you think that the EU's intervention in promoting the wineries and also building infrastructure that would help the wine grapes and the wine to get out for export is going to make it easier for you to import wines into the United States, or do you think it's more difficult? And also, do you think that these interventions have encouraged local, like farm grapes, you know, open field pollination, like the local ones that are not necessarily great but are interesting and local? Do you think that's going to kind of get rid of them in favor of a lot of these French varietals, or do you think that these interventions have actually helped to kind of promote the local wine industry and make it available to what I care about? And Mason, I hope that this is what you care about too. As much as we hate the government, I just want more good wine for me.
I was going to say, Jacob, you know, my favorite wine country is Georgia, and they have 5,000 to 8,000 grape varietals.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So Jackson, to pass this back into your court, what do you think the EU's intervention in Portugal, in particular the wine region you're interested in, has done, or the wine regions you're interested in? What do you think their intervention has done to the wine industry? Is that going to make it better for Americans or worse for Americans?
Well, in general, it's going to make it the overall impact of the EU, despite all the issues for Americans and for me in particular, in the case of certain Portuguese wines, is overall positive at the moment. It makes it a lot easier to export it to the US. You don't have to sign, you don't have to do any extra papers. You don't have to do FDA testing. All of that stuff makes a big difference for me. Okay. So that does make a difference. On the other hand, I think in both cases, I think it's been exaggerated as well. So I think this is something that I think I actually have to give the Portuguese credit to in this, is that things haven't changed that much.
Okay.
In the Douro River Valley, in Barreira, in the Dow region, even in Alentejo, where they're experimenting a bit more with international varieties, it's still overwhelmingly Portuguese varieties. And the appetite for Portuguese varieties versus international varieties, the sort of the French, the noble grapes, the cult wines, has increased. The market has changed. People want more subtle, more interesting, more diverse wines right now. So the demand right now isn't in place for more Cabernet from Portugal, besides for, certain crowds in the US, but it's for more interesting different things. And I think that's going to increase, and more people are going to want diversity in wine because that's the more interesting aspects of it. So despite the EU, for better or for worse, they have pulled up a bunch of shitty grapes, and that's a good thing. Not that should have been done.
Right.
But they've also created issues pulling up perfectly good grapes in perfectly good locations that somebody could take a look at that plot of land and say, oh, that could have made great wine. We just didn't realize before. So it's complicated, but overall I'm optimistic.
Okay, well, I think that's a really great summary and a great place for us to end. Mason, do you want to quickly do the plugs?
Well, so first, real quick, I want to give everybody an idea of what the report we were actually talking about. So This is the European Court of Auditors. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what the European Court specifically means. Obviously, we all know what auditors means. It's a special report from 2014. Is the EU investment and promotion support to the wine sector well managed, and are its results on the on the competitiveness of the EU wines demonstrated? This is number 9. So just so everybody knows. But yes, so we are Tasting Anarchy. You can follow us on Twitter at Tasting Anarchy, or Tasting Anarchy. You can email us at tastinganarchy@gmail.com. You can also check out our site, which we are hopefully getting better updated, possibly getting some reviews from Jackson himself, if he feels so inclined to grace us with those. And he's certainly welcome to. He's certainly welcome not to if he chooses not to, at tastinganarchy.com. Jackson, I believe you can be followed on Twitter at just Jackson Blood, right?
Yeah, just Jackson Blood 1 on Twitter. Easy to find if you don't mind my obnoxious opinions about, I think, pretty much everything.
I don't think they're obnoxious. They're fun.
An obnoxious opinion, so I will recommend highly you do those things. Yeah. Real quick, we have 2 friend podcasts that, 2 higher level friend podcasts. We are friends, obviously, with anybody who doesn't believe in socialism as enforced. If you believe in socialism between you and your friend, hey, great. Let's talk about it and see why we don't think it's a good idea, but you can do whatever you want. You can always follow the Friends Against Government podcast, Car Camp It and Birdarchy, also known as the Fags. Always a good time. And then Sounds Like Liberty. Jacob has been on it. I have recorded an episode with him. Hopefully they'll actually post it. I'm not implying that they won't. It may be out already by the time you're hearing this episode. May come out this week. Don't really know. But you can always go over there and listen to Nikki P and Lizzie if you're interested in music. Friends, they're always talking about something bizarre, generally about clout, I think. Yeah. Bird and Robbie the Fire. I think they're the same person, despite them being on the same podcast and pretending. But we'll keep that feud low today.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's good. Jackson, do you have anything that you want to plug? Actually, real quick, can you give us a couple of minutes summary of how your wine import, not necessarily the business, but how is that all working? I'm sure that's a lot of work.
I've been working on it. I need to keep up pace with some of the forms, but it's been going. I'm moving along, making slow, steady progress. But
good.
I'm really, I'm ready to get it going. Just need to. A lot of it's just the waiting time,
Do you have a time frame for your shooting for, like when it would?
So anywhere between, honestly, this is how crazy it is. Anywhere between 6 and 18 months.
Okay.
Well,
right,
cool. that's not bad, because I wasn't sure if you were like 2020 or 2020.
Maybe not.
In my own life, that's less than 13 months away, but.
Right. Okay. Well, anything else you'd like to plug, Jackson?
I think that should be it.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you, Jackson, for joining us. Mason, I think that that wraps up the show today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. From me, stay free.
Stay free, everybody.
Start fighting all night, knocking down windows and tearing down doors, drinking half gallons and calling for more, drinking wine, sport you to drink wine, wine, sport you to drink wine, wine, sport you to drink wine, pass that bottle to me, hoy, drink at me. Oh, give me some of that slop. Oh, pass that bottle to me. If you want to get along in Peterstown, buy some wine and pass it around. Age runs up to 49. All them cats, they love sweet wine. Drinking wine's for you to drink wine. Wine's for you to drink wine. Wine's for you to drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Hoy! Wine, wine, wine. Elderberry. Wine, wine, wine. Cherry, cherry. Wine, wine, wine. Blackberry. Wine, wine, wine. Port and sherry. Wine, wine, wine. Oh, pass that bottle to me. Now down on Gill Street at Willie's Den, he wasn't selling but American gin. One soldier wanted a bottle of wine. He hipped that cat for $1 and a dime. I'm drinking wine for you to drink wine. Wine for you to drink wine. Wine for you to drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Now I got a nickel, have you got a dime? Let's get together and get some wine. Some buys fifth and some buys fourth. When you get together, you're doing things smart. Drinking wine for you to drink wine. Wine for you to drink